Metro Last Light is the sequel to Metro 2033, the game that was literally just an entire corridor lengthened out for an 8 or so long single player campaign. If I had to dumb down Metro 2033, I'd say it's a much more linear version of the Stalker games with a greater focus on storytelling and keeping the player on a very set narrative. Last Light was developed by 4A Games and released in 2013, and a Redux version was also eventually released for the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One in 2014, which had a few gameplay changes, but is pretty much just a graphical update used as an excuse to resell the game on the 8th generation consoles. So the story itself takes place a year after the events of the first game, following on from the so-called bad ending. Now I'm going to assume that if you're watching this video then you've played the first game, if not you're probably going to get a few things spoiled. So quick recap, in the Metro series the world has been destroyed by nuclear war, with the survivors being split up into independents, communists or Nazis. As Artyom, you're a member of the Rangers, one of the independent survivors living in one of the many underground metro stations across Moscow. Anyway, the bad ending from the previous games resulted in Artyom launching a missile strike against the Dark Ones, which was a species of creepy looking mutants who we actually learn are trying to help humanity. In the game's opening, you're hunting down what's believed to be the last of the Dark Ones, which happens to be a child no less, before the thing is captured by the Nazis along with Artyom. From this point on, you're quite literally just moving in a single direction for the rest of the campaign as you try to locate the last Dark One, avoiding the Reds, the Nazis, and dealing with all the various types of mutants that haunt the Metro tunnels. And much like the first game, Last Light just has this overbearing atmosphere and this constant feeling of immersion. Again, running on the 4A engine, it's just a phenomenal looking game. Some of the scripted sequences where you're moving through an area populated with a couple dozen NPCs are so rich in detail it really feels like you're in this real place. From things like the lighting and the atmospheric effects through to the designs for all the mutants you end up coming across. It's not really a horror game per se, though it does have its fair share of spooky moments. It's more unsettling than anything else. So you're probably going to be biting your nails more than jumping out of your seat like a little bitch. Some of the new mutant types are admittedly quite terrifying though. There's this sort of spider/scorpion thing you have to avoid a few times in the campaign that's frightened by light. And if you're not scared of spiders before playing this, well, you probably will be when you're finished. All of the various weapons look and sound great too, and you're able to modify them to fit silencers, scopes, and all that kind of stuff which visually updates their appearance. Strangely enough, probably the weakest element of the visuals is the female character models, which you'll notice a lot in this game as it has a fair bit of TNA. There's also self-shadowing, but Artyom has no reflection in mirrors either, which is a little bit weird. But other than that, it still holds its own. It's a great benchmarking tool for anyone who's just built a PC and wants to give their system a real run for its money. Last Light doesn't really add anything all that new to the gameplay. It's really just a glorified expansion pack or DLC more than anything else. In fact, a lot of the environments look pretty similar to areas we already visited in the first game. The gameplay is broken up into a few key areas. You're either walking around listening to people talk, which honestly makes up about 50% of the gameplay. Then there's areas when you're encountering other people, either the Reds or the Nazis, where you're given the option to sneak by or go through guns blazing, which I'd say makes up about 30%. Then finally the last 20 or so percent where you're all but forced into fighting waves and waves of mutants, which are the weakest areas of the game. I think the reason for this is because Last Light is a game that really emphasizes managing your resources carefully. The game all but tells you that you should favor stealth over combat, and it's really easy to sneak right through enemy compounds without getting seen once. It can be a lot less fun though playing this way because the shooting is really satisfying and enjoyable against human opponents, but ultimately if you're going for that good ending, which you kinda should be, you'll mostly be avoiding combat. And then having said that, there's like a dozen or so of these areas where they outright force you to kill droves and droves of mutants who can quite annoyingly take a bunch of bullets before buying the farm. And also just take out a massive chunk of your well-conserved supplies. A few sections later in the game force you to kill a bunch of soldiers, and combat on the higher difficulties can be over really quickly due to the high damage you take. It just seems like they're trying to appeal to a larger demographic of gamers by including these forced combat sections, and they're arguably the weaker parts of the campaign. But mostly it just kind of goes against the grain with the awesome Ranger difficulty mode, which kicks up the damage you take from enemies and limits resources even more. Those moments when you're hiding in the shadows, avoiding an entire camp of Nazis, is always more exciting and tense than standing in a corner as you're gang raped by mutants from every side. And don't even get me started on the goddamn boss fights, which are just utterly horse shit. Ultimately, the game shines when you're given the options for combat or stealth, but when they force you into either mode is when it kinda sucks. Another reason why you'll probably avoid most human enemies is that you're given moral points for not killing anyone. Like the first game, by exploring the world and not just rushing through the whole thing like you're hopped up on Monster Energy drinks will often reward you with moral points, which will give you either the good or bad ending. Some of the events where you gain a moral point are really touching too, and they give the game a real human element. Like something as simple as donating money to a beggar or finding some kid's teddy bear. It's poignant stuff that just kind of drags you into the game world. Now, part of what brings Last Light down is its linearity, which is actually also its biggest strength. It's a strength because it's really this tightly crafted, well-told story, but it's a weakness in the sense that you don't really have any kind of control over what happens. There's moments where you're on rails in a raft or a minecart or something, and it feels like you're on a ride at Disney World where the whole world is moving around you and you're just kind of sitting there observing things. There's countless little side things to see and do, but once you've spent like 30 seconds going off the beaten path, you're still just moving back down the same familiar looking tunnel until the next scripted sequence occurs. The plot in this one does get a little bit muddled up as well. Initially you're just trying to take out the remaining Dark One, but then you're escaping from the Nazis, then the commies, and then you're helping some guy bust out of prison before the two of you get separated and your end goal becomes even more confusing. On top of that, there's also a love interest for Artyom that feels a little bit ham-fisted as well, mostly because the girl in question looks like a mannequin. I also noticed some issues with the subtitles. Now, I believe the best way to play the game is with the original Russian dialogue and subtitles enabled. I mean, the game is set in Moscow, it seems silly to play it with English dialogue. But the issue here is that only the main dialogue is given subtitles, so when you're moving around some of the inhabited metro stations, eavesdropping on conversations with NPCs, you often can't tell what the hell they're saying, as there's no subtitles included. Again, like the first game, the mechanic of selling weapons is a little bit useless. I never really found a single time where I had to sell or buy a new weapon, and one of the guns I got during the first couple areas in the game, I literally had for about 75% of the campaign. The currency in the game is again gold bullets, and even on Ranger difficulty mode, I never felt like this was a resource I really had to worry about. Metro Last Light is a little bit longer than your standard FPS campaign. The first time I played it, it took me around 12 or so hours, and if you really spend your time exploring and interacting with NPCs, it wouldn't surprise me if it took double that time to finish the whole thing. It's quite a depressing game at times, as it's often devoid of humour or anything remotely lighthearted, and it does paint this eerie picture of what humanity might have to resort to if we ever did face the premise of nuclear war. Whether or not you prefer this to the first game is really just down to personal preference. I mean, personally I found Last Light to be way more polished and I enjoyed the story a lot more. Нет, пожалуйста. Either way though, I think they're both incredible games that have one of the most palpable and engrossing atmospheres in any single game I think I've ever played. If you have the patience to appreciate the game for what it is and enjoy its slower moments, and you can also accept that you're not going to be running around shooting everyone you see, then there is a lot to be gained from playing it.